speaker today to learn from each other, Anna-Karin Palm Olsson, who holds a master's degree in international legal sciences, specializing in European law and human rights. She has been at the ILO for over a year now, working as a technical specialist on labor market services. She comes from international affairs at Arbeidsformidlingen, the Swedish public employment service, where she worked for over 17 years, mostly with international affairs as a project manager and responsible for the international aspects of Agenda 2030. She has worked with the free movement of workers within the EU and mobility of workers globally. She believes that employment is the strongest poverty reductor we have today and an inherent right for all persons to move freely across borders. Anna-Karin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nicole, and a warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for participating in this webinar. I will go through a quick presentation on basically the Convention 88 that we are highlighting today, but also Convention 181 that is promoted jointly together from the ILO perspective, because we can see this as a good legal basis for regulating and enhancing and developing employment services in any country. Next slide, please. Employment services are seen as indispensable. Employment services are empirically known to be one of the most cost-effective labor market interventions to facilitate matching workers with jobs and enhancing their employability and helping employers find the workers they need. As we all know, the world was already in a state of flux, changing at a pace never seen before, even before the pandemic and before these global crises that we have seen. And globally now, workers are changing jobs 3 to 5 times on average over the course of their careers. However, in some countries, this figure can be even more than twice than that. And there are persistent skill shortages all around the world in almost all countries. Workers, governments, and employers need employment services to cope, manage, and navigate labor market disruptions. Workers need support in dealing with job losses and career changes, in moving from wage work to self-employment or from full-time jobs to more flexible work arrangements, and in general, with preparing for future jobs and skills. Employers often need assistance in locating and recruiting people with specific skills, as well as to reskill existing staff to cope with economic and sectorial changes that affect their businesses. And governments need a way to boost businesses, employment, and their economies by creating a reliable source of labor market information, match job seekers with opportunities, develop skills in the labor force, and encourage transition towards sectors and occupations with high employment potential. Next slide, please. And so now today we will be speaking on the Convention 88 from 1948 on employment services. Next slide, please. This convention is a bit of an older technical convention at the ILO, but it's deemed to be up to date as employment services still remain at the core of the labor market facilitation and mitigation. It focuses on the free services with national coverage, including a local network, accessibility for all persons in a country, and also this kind of inclusive measures that you can see almost like a red thread throughout this convention. Next slide, please. Article 6 lists possible services, but is not exhaustive, focused on effectiveness to ensure that the players on the labor market benefit from the services. Vulnerable groups such as youth, persons with disabilities are mentioned in this convention, showing the priority of public employment services to be inclusive and to promote inclusiveness. Also mentioning the role that PES can play public employment services can play in redundancies, changes, and development in the labor market, supporting employers in need in that aspect as well. Next slide, please. The other target group of public employment services is, of course, employers, and we can see this very clearly also in Article 7 of the Convention. Which is quite mirrored also in the priority of SDG 8 in the Agenda 2030. The priority to engage employers, private sector, and adhere to labor market developments and changes in the services, ensuring mitigation and facilitation of the labor market are aligned with such development as well from the government. And the dual customer groups, if you will, of public employment services, we can see that the most successful and functional public employment services offer adequate services to employers as well, engage with employers, and have allocated resources and specialized services for this particular customer group as well. We could hear, and the most important parameter seeming to be the ability for PES to showcase the added value of using PES services. We have also seen that laws, for instance, committing all employers to register any vacancies at public employment services has shown to have little to negative effect. It's the service offer, the added value of that service offer that has the greatest impact. Next slide, please. So you can see here that for a technical convention, Convention 88 still has quite good coverage around the world, but it needs to increase with the persisting megatrends of globalization, digitalization, demographic shifts, and climate change. It's just easier to cooperate when you have the same basis and the same legal platform, if you will. Next slide, please. So public employment services continuously contribute to the social and economic development in a country, and also between countries, as can be seen in the chart. Public employment services are at the core of the labor market, bringing different players and stakeholders together, enhancing the functioning of the labor market and ensuring equal opportunities for all, focusing on the most vulnerable and standing for inclusiveness, which means that this is also the contribution to social protection and rights of workers, while still also giving services to employers and the economic development, and thus the economic development of a country. Next slide, please. In connection to Convention 88, we have Convention 181 from 1997 on private employment agencies as well. Next slide, please. Private employment agencies can act as a stepping stone to formal and regular employment, if well regulated and monitored. Acknowledging the contribution it's very important to also acknowledge the contribution that private employment agencies give to the functioning of the labor market. And this convention very much targets the ambition to level the playing field and protect serious actors that work with private employment as private employment agencies. Public employment services, we can see this around the world, cannot work in silos. This way regulation is there for cooperation and collaboration to ensure better facilitation and mitigation, bringing together both customer groups, if you will, looking at both perspectives and interests while still focusing on economic and social growth, while having inclusiveness and focus on vulnerable group at the core. Next slide, please. Around the world, there is not such a good coverage for C181 as for C88. The latest ratification was from Nigeria in March. There is an increased interest for Convention 181, mostly driven on by the globalization and post-pandemic trends. Part of it is also looking at protection for migrant workers that we saw was a very vulnerable group also within the pandemic, and of course also in connection to domestic workers in that aspect. Next slide, please. Together, the Public Employment Services Convention and the Private Employment Agencies Convention provide a solid normative basis for the effective employment services needed for a responsive and inclusive labor market facilitation and reintegration. Ratifying these conventions provides a basis for development of a conducive national legal framework for implementing a coordinated system of employment services comprising different actors in the public, private, and third sectors. An effective national legal framework ensures adequate checks and balances in the employment services ecosystem, if you will, levels the playing field for all players, protects workers from abuse, and enables effective institutional frameworks for monitoring and enforcement, both statutory and voluntary. Next slide, please. The purpose of ratifying these conventions is it's very much focused on supporting, strengthening, and developing what's already there in the country. It's not supposed to be an add-on, but rather just enhance what's already there. Next slide, please. Here you can see a simplified version of how the ILO can support countries towards ratifications of these technical conventions. I will leave you with this information and not go through it as much in detail because I want to leave the floor for my colleague Joe as well. In addition to this PowerPoint, I also included some more materials concerning the ratification and also the different conventions that I just spoke about. So please also make sure that you get this presentation so you can actually read up on it, and then don't hesitate to contact me should you have any questions. slide number 17, and that's it for me. Thank you very much for letting me speak. I look forward to hearing from Joe and also any questions or interactions that we might have afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna-Karin, for your illuminating presentation, which not only provides an insight on public employment services, but also on private institutions and the private sector. So here I would like to underscore that even if your country has adopted these conventions, it's crucial for every country to verify whether there's still an active application. So anyway, so please feel free also to put some questions in the Q&A box. I've seen that there are none so far, but if you want to have some, some answers to your questions, even if we're not able to answer them all today, we will send a sum up later to all participants that have been attending in this webinar today. So, however, at this juncture, it becomes highly significant to illuminate the evidence-based and practical collaborations. So I would like to explore now how public employment services can concentrate its efforts in line with Convention ATA to actively assist employers in their quest. So, and that is where our next expert, Dr. Joe Ingold, comes in. Dr. Joe Ingold is an associate professor of human resource management at Deakin Business School and has spent over 2 decades working in and around employment services. Joe's research and teaching encompass employability and skills, employment engagement, recruitment, and talent acquisition and workplace inclusion. She has built she has built the largest evidence base globally on employer engagement in employment services and works with governments, industry, and practitioners to embed best practices. In 2023, she published the first book on employer engagement and employment services. Joe is a fellow of the Institute of Employability Professionals and co-chairs the UK Employment-Related Services Association's Employer Engagement Forum. She's a fellow of the Higher Education Academy, a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, a chartered academic member of the Australian Human Resource Institute, and editor of the academic journal Work, Employment and Society. So, Joe, I would love to give the floor to you now.
Thank you so much, Nicole. A pleasure to be here, and good evening from Naarm, otherwise known as Melbourne, Australia. And as we begin, I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Wurundjeri lands of the Kulin Nation as well. Okay, so what I've got this morning, or whatever time zone you're in at the moment, is a curated kind of snapshot of the evidence base that I've constructed with various colleagues, research teams over the past 12 years, which is very much focused on the demand side of employment services. And at the start, I just want to say that I and colleagues have looked at what I talk about as the employment services ecosystem. So that is to say, following on from Anna-Karin's presentation, the public employment services directly delivered services, but also those that are commissioned and delivered by other actors, so providers from the non-profit and private sectors as well. I was just checking that there was nothing happening in the chat that I needed to know about. So my evidence base is from the UK and Denmark and Australia. And as I said, this is really just a snapshot of the key messages. Many people, some of them on the call this morning, know that I can talk for a long time about employer engagement in employment services. It's something I feel very passionate about. But I hope that what I will offer to you this morning is really a flavour of the evidence base and also some key takeaways for your service commissioning and delivery. But I just wanted to put a footnote there that it's, even though this, I'm talking quite briefly about all of this. There is a whole host of data and articles and various publications which can be found at the end of the presentation as well, which Nicole and colleagues will be sharing. So very happy for you to follow up with me as well, and hopefully answer a few questions at the end. So firstly, I have talked about the three customers of employment services. The commissioner, if it is indeed outsourced services, customers, clients, participants, candidates, as we call the individuals who participate in active labour market programmes and employment services. But employers have really been neglected. When I first started looking at this area in 2011, I was staggered by the lack of evidence on the demand side, and there's still a kind of fairly sparse evidence base, I guess you could say, compared to what we know about the supply side of employment services. What we also know is that there's huge complexity in the employment services ecosystem, to a greater or lesser extent, depending on the country. So employers actually find it really difficult to engage in services and programs. We definitely can't assume that employers know about programs or how they might help them. Although in Denmark, I did find that the policy continuity and the smaller number of actors definitely meant that employers knew more about activation than, say, in Australia or the UK. And there's, as I've mentioned, not only a lack of scholarship on the demand side, but certainly policies and commissioning have really not focused on that demand side, which is quite staggering, given that the importance of employment services, and as Anna-Karin has just outlined, is assisting people into employment. So firstly, just a couple of points just about definitions, because the literature from practitioners and also scholars talks interchangeably about involvement, participation, engagement. Without going into too much detail and getting too navel-gazing today, I just want to put forward a couple of definitions that I've discussed in my work with colleagues. So firstly, the two faces of employer engagement. So not only the extent to which employers are engaged in employment services, but also importantly, the activities of actors, either strategically or on the ground, in order to engage those employers. So we definitely see it as a two-way process. And I'll develop that point further shortly. With my colleagues from the UK, Denmark and the Netherlands, we've talked about employer engagement as the active involvement of employers in addressing the societal challenge of promoting the labour market participation of vulnerable groups. Although since I wrote that, I think there are much better words that we could use than vulnerable groups, such as priority groups, underserved or overlooked talent, as has been talked about in Australia. Following on from Anna-Karin's other point as well, I think it's important to, and I've discovered this early on in my research, important to state that employment service providers, whatever sector they come from, are labour market intermediaries, in the same way that private employment agencies stand between the employer, and sorry, there's an error on that side, it should be demand side, and candidates supply side. So they are sort of mediating between those two sides of the labour market. And some of my early work, which I then developed further, has been about these key roles of employment service providers as intermediaries, firstly as information providers, and secondly as matchmakers. So in terms of information providers, that is essentially a brokerage service. So bringing to the attention of candidates vacancies that they may not otherwise know about. So that's where we see those online job boards. And I suppose what we'd see is a historical and typical activity of the employment service in most countries. And also importantly, bringing to the attention of employers candidates who they may not otherwise look at. So candidates who, because of various challenges or lack of perceptions about their lack of skills or experience, and their CVs just end up being sifted out at an early stage. So there's that important point of kind of exchange of information between labour market intermediaries and employers, which we see in the private employment agency sector. But then what we have seen is that information provision is quite a sort of surface level way of engaging employers. But the really critical thing is that providers become matchmakers for employers' needs. And this is something that I've developed in my work over the years. And more recently has led to a suite of research programs that's focused on good work and job quality and the role of employment services within that. So moving really to that piece on workplace inclusion and really looking at HR practices, recruitment and talent acquisition practices, which hopefully you can see goes beyond the information provision component. It's also worth mentioning that in terms of labour market intermediaries, there is, of course, as Anna-Karin has pointed out, the link between employment service providers and private employment agencies. And there's sometimes a kind of chain through which, employment service providers will then engage with private employment agencies, because that's sometimes the only way of getting access to a particular employer. And that's definitely something that I've observed in the UK and Australia in particular. Another aspect that I discovered at quite an early stage was what we saw as key stages of employer engagement. So firstly, it is a process of sales. It's about making a value proposition to employers. It's making the public employment service stand out from other recruitment channels that employers may use. But we definitely can't assume that employers will come to the public employment service because it's free of charge. They need to be convinced of the value of using the service. And then we go on to the matching and, importantly, the building of trusted relationships, which I discovered again in the early stages of my research and have developed further. And what I also have pointed out in various publications is the role of inter-organisational relationships between the pairs and employers, but also the role of intra-organisational relationships within provider organisations. And what I mean by that is making sure that your employer engagement teams and the teams of people at the front line who engage with candidates, clients of employment services, those individuals who you want to help into work, making sure that they engage with each other, and also that there's some kind of coordination within the organisation, because there's no point going out collecting vacancies if you haven't got the candidate pool to match to that. And there's more that I could say about that, but I think that point hopefully stands for now. The other thing, dealing with the relational aspect, the fostering of relationships, which I think will be recognised by most recruiters out there, is what we identified as relational engagement. So deeper, repeated and systematic engagement can happen between the pairs and employers. But typically we found more evidence of instrumental engagement, kind of one-off, ad hoc transactional activities. But this has been really clear from the data that we've collected over the years. And interestingly, what we found was that in Denmark, it was the number of employers, the percentage of employers that were relationally engaged with job centres was double what we found in the UK. And we put that down to a more coordinated, less fragmented institutional context and the continuity of policies and programmes that I mentioned earlier, and the smaller number of programmes. But that didn't mean the relationship building wasn't there. But conversely, in a very fragmented and quite competitive context like the UK and Australia, providers are having to work really hard to go out and engage employers. So just something for you to consider in terms of the strategy for your own pairs. Another aspect that we have looked at is how conditionality in its various forms, i.e. the requirements placed upon the supply side, actually impacts on demand side engagement. So again, we looked at the UK and Denmark and found that particularly in the UK, the conditionality regime was really problematic. It was also quite problematic in Denmark, but the UK context really stood out in terms of employers referring to just being inundated with unsuitable and unfiltered job applications in order to meet conditionality requirements. So this is something, again, important for you to think about when you're devising policies, especially across social protection and active labour market programmes, is exactly how those particular different policy domains intersect. Because, again, it made it really hard for providers on the ground to actually engage with employers, because they were, and the media rhetoric, which we see across a number of countries about people who are unemployed being kind of faulty products that the PES is trying to kind of sell to employers. So it kind of risks tarnishing candidates even before you start. So that's definitely something to watch out for. In relation to my point earlier about the information provider, labour market intermediaries, we also did some analysis, quantitative analysis, which showed, again, this was UK and Denmark, which showed what we thought was the case, that large employers offered economies of scale to PES in terms of being able to send quite a number of candidates to large employers with a large number of vacancies. This what's called in the recruitment sector as spray and pray approach, not recommended, because i.e., on all probability, if you've got a large employer with a large number of vacancies, some of the candidates you push towards them are going to stick, but they may not be the best matches. But there is a good point that we found about large employers having, it's hard to access decision makers within large organisations, although because they've got quite large HR departments. Conversely, small employers can be easier to engage, but we know that it's a lot more resource intensive and smaller numbers of vacancies. But this is important when you're thinking about how you commission or how you make your active labour market strategy in terms of the demand side, and actually thinking about how programs are set up in order to incentivize different behaviours, whether there's financial incentives involved for outsourced providers, or there are other kind of performance targets that public sector frontline staff have to meet. Crucially, what we found was that active labour market programmes can help people into work, including people with disability, but it's employers' recruitment and selection processes that pose a significant barrier. And this is why we started looking further at the HR processes and practices, and also the potential of PES to actually really engage employers in order to address those problematic and discriminatory recruitment and selection processes. And it can happen, and I think that's definitely the direction that any PES should be going in, but dependent on the labour market context, of course. Another point that came out of our research was the role of social networks or our collective bargaining. So in Denmark, we found, perhaps unsurprisingly, that collective bargaining agreements were really important in terms of employers' engagement or their propensity to become engaged in employment services. In the UK, it was more likely to be social networks, and we thought this was really interesting because what it tells us is if your PES can engage with an employer who's part of a social network, whether that's Chamber of Commerce or other actually professional networks, because we looked at a wide variety, it means that if you engage with them, you could also engage with their wider network. So it may seem an obvious point, but actually we thought this was really important. And also that trust in programs was transmitted through these professional networks of employers' associations and trade unions. So it's something for you to think about in the institutional context of your own country. Another piece of dimension of the research that may be of interest is we looked at the skills involved in engaging employers. And this is something I'm asked about quite a lot, particularly at the moment. And there are some really interesting reforms happening in Australia in terms of employment services, or potential reforms, a first principles inquiry into employment services. But these skills are important because the skills that are involved in engaging employers are qualitatively different to the skills that are involved in engaging with candidates or individuals on employment services programs. There is some crossover because you've got to really build trust. Ideally, you should build trust, build that relationship at the front line and not be transactional. And it's also true of employment services. But what's come out from our research is the real focus on the kind of sales specific skills, which I think certainly has been a bit uncomfortable for some of the frontline staff that we have researched over the years, who felt that really wasn't for them because their skills were not really in selling something. But I would also say that if you're a frontline, if you've got a voluntary program, for example, a voluntary active labour market program, you still need to engage in a kind of sales process, and you've got to really be encouraging and building that rapport with the individual. But it is different when it comes to employers, where you are going to be competing with private employment agencies who are out there, or other people who are phoning up employers offering training and all sorts of things. So you really need to be across the different sources of labour market intelligence, have a good understanding of your programme offer, but also put that aside, because what you really need to do is understand the employer. One thing that my good colleague Tony Carr, who I co-chair the Employment Related Services Association Forum with, we've talked about over the years has been a needs-led rather than a product-led strategy for employer engagement. So that is to say, you don't go out just offering particular programs, because what employers really want to know is what it is that you are offering them in concrete terms, what it's going to do for their business, what kind of commitment is required from them. But they also want employer-facing staff who can understand their business and actually diagnose their needs, because employers don't always know what their needs are. We can see that in the Australian labour market currently, where we've got a lot of unfilled vacancies, but we've got a lot of people who also are in receipt of social protection and actually would like to work, and we're seeing there's quite a mismatch. But there is some great work going on in actually changing how employers recruit. And ultimately, I would say, and this comes on to a point I'm going to make in a moment about good examples, is the kind of no wrong door, hiding the wiring approach for employers. You want to make it easy for employers to kind of avail themselves, take advantage of different programs and initiatives. The other thing that I would add here is, especially if you've got any kind of outsourcing, but not just if you've got outsourcing, is sometimes you've got providers, you've got employment service providers who are in competition with each other, and that just adds to the confusion and crowding. And as I mentioned, we advocate for that needs-led approach, but we also advocate for what's been called co-opetition by two American academics, but they didn't talk about it in respect of employment services. This was something I have specifically written about in terms of its applicability to employment services. So collaboration amidst competition. And the rule of thumb seems to be, if an employer's requirements go beyond one provider, then they need to collaborate, because you've got a defined caseload with particular providers. It's not like a private employment agency where you could go out and look for people. You've got the caseload that you've got. And on the right is the competition value net, which is really about establishing who are your competitors, but who are your complementers. So who can complement your offer, who adds rather than takes away from your offer, which might be a skills provider, some allied health, wraparound services. So I'd really, again, in terms of that ecosystem, try and compel you to think about that in your own pairs. Just a few more recent I'm just mindful of the time, that a few more recent pieces of research. So we have been moving from looking at the barriers to the enablers of employer engagement. And from our research in Australia, which you can access freely, we've identified that there were a number of benefits that employers themselves perceived in relation to their engagement in employment services. And these included HR benefits, so assistance with recruitment, and this also had financial benefits such as increased efficiencies in recruitment, better matching. There were also what we call CSR benefits for large organisations, corporate social responsibility. But for smaller organisations, we've referred to it as local social responsibility. So employers were also interested to give people a chance in their local community. So that could be really powerful. Of course, there were financial benefits, as I've mentioned, one in terms of the increased efficiencies, but also direct financial assistance. This can include wage subsidies, although we know there are limitations to this. But it could also include other forms of financial assistance to help someone get into their first job. And there are a number of funds that many PESs have that through their programs that do this. The other really interesting finding was that a micro employer could benefit from something like a wage subsidy to grow their business, to hire a member of staff earlier than they otherwise would be able to do. We only had small evidence of this, but this is something we'll definitely be looking at in the future. Finally, I just want to showcase briefly the book that Nicole was kind enough to mention, Employer Engagement, Making Active Labour Market Policies Work, edited by myself and Patrick McGurk, who's at Queen Mary University in London, another academic who looks at the demand side of employment services. Its coverage is Denmark, Germany, the UK, also the Netherlands, so I've missed that out, and the US and Australia. So plenty of coverage. Yes, it's from Global North, but I'm really hoping that other people will be focusing on coverage from Global South as the evidence base grows. This was the focus on Global North was simply related to we were wanting to have a book that was a primer on the topic of employer engagement, and that also had the kind of leading authors and scholars in that topic area. But also we do have in this next slide, I'm just briefly talking about the three a typology that we came up with just as a flavour of some of the information you can find in the book. And due to time, I won't talk through this in detail, but this is used by others in the book to analyse some of the developments. The regulation approach being more about legislation, the facilitation approach, which is more the kind of matching but maybe a surface level matching and brokerage. We found less evidence of the negotiation approach, which is really where PES actually goes and works more intensively with employers to try to change their requirements in terms of their recruitment. But one of the things I also wanted to mention before I turn to the examples was, and I'll just go back, is in our book, there is sadly no magic bullet for employer engagement, but we hope that this primer offers many lessons. And the book is divided into macro, meso, and micro. So that is to say macro, institutional, middle level of kind of PES delivery, and then the micro level, which is very much focused on employers' HR policies and practices. And also in each of the sections, the three sections, we do have practitioner case studies. So case studies, chapters that are written solely or by practitioners or co-authored between practitioners and academics. So hopefully you'll find that of interest, and I hope, and I've put a slide at the end which has got a discount code as well, and if you have any problems getting hold of the book, do let me know. Feel free to contact me at the email address at the end of my slides or via LinkedIn. And I think it's just worth dwelling on a couple of examples before we move on. So I'll go to the Australian government first, but in terms of that concierge hiding the wiring service, something that the Australian government has done more recently is to have a network of employment facilitators and employment kind of networks within the 52 employment regions in Australia. And part of the reason for this is because Australia's had an outsourced employment service since 1998. The only one who has. The closest relation is, of course, the UK, and that's currently under review. But the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations initiative is designed to really hide the wiring for employers and respond to particular local and regional labour market demands. And I think this is really important because labour markets are local and regional, so it is really critical to be able to have some kind of responsive kind of initiative capability. On the other hand, the Danish Agency for Labour Market and Recruitment, STAR, a few years ago, initiated a national kind of hotline for employers, and that was for the opposite reason, because Denmark has since 2010 had a very localized and regionalized employment policy devolved to municipalities. So one of the ways of kind of dealing with larger employers whose requirements cross a number of regions was by having this kind of approach where employers could contact the departments and they weren't having to deal with multiple different job centres. And then similarly, we've had something like that in the UK, where the Work and Health Programme prime providers have got together and with the Department for Work and Pensions, and there's a website so that employers can list their vacancies, and that will then be percolated through to the provider in that particular area. And of course, it's not just about vacancy sharing, it is about that relationship building as well. Which brings me on finally to the REACT partnership. There's a chapter on this in the book, actually. There's a chapter which compares the Australian and UK approaches to collaboration and competition. But the REACT partnership came about in the last few years as part of the Restart programme contracted by the Department for Work and Pensions in the UK, which reduced the number of prime providers. So that was an important aspect of the commissioning process, having less providers than previously. But importantly, this REACT partnership is a network of providers where the aim is to collaborate and have minimum standards for engagement of employers. So that's a really nice example that's been initiated by providers, which has also kind of had some response to the commissioning framework as well, but provider-led, and then equally the other examples of commissioner-led, perhaps. Finally, I just mentioned that I'd have the discount code, and then my email's there, and there are lots of references at the end. So I will send the up-to-date version of the slides to Nicole, and then ask Nicole to share those. And thank you very much for listening. And I'm just conscious of time, so I'm just having a look whether we've got any questions.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Joe, for your presentation, which almost wraps up this webinar with a comprehensive perspective and provides a great overview on employer outreach and the connection to the standards of the conventions as well. So nevertheless, as I promised, we now will be able to draw some questions. We have some questions also in the chat, and the first one goes to Anna-Karin, and it is about, does the ratification campaign focus on countries supplying migrant workers, respectively on countries receiving and depending migrant workers? So Anna-Karin, if you're able to answer these questions, we would be very delighted.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the question. No, this campaign is focusing, this ratification campaign is focusing on employment services in general. So both the public and the private side of employment services. And that's what these conventions stand for. Of course, within these conventions, vulnerable groups like migrants are mentioned. And what we can see is that the interest, especially for Convention 181, is increased when there is a connection to migrants, mostly in sending countries, I would say, but also in receiving countries, because of the need and the want to actually do fair recruitment, because there is this provision in Convention 181 of non-charging workers. And that's also one of the articles that's mostly debated on the international arena. But at the same time, it's a higher protection for migrant workers because migrant workers usually go through private recruitment agencies, and that's where this provision comes in for decent work and to ensure that the migrant workers are not indebted and so on by paying very high fees for getting a job in another country. But in itself, there are other conventions from the ILO that protects migrant workers per se, which is the C143 and so on. So there are other international legal labor standards that protects migrant workers more in a more targeted manner than these two conventions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna-Karin. And I was just wanted to get back also with Joe. And so you were talking about the micro level negotiation and convincing, building relationships. And also we have some kind of question that goes towards that. Somebody asked in the chat, how can trust between public employment service and employer be strengthened? Maybe you have some kind of insight, some kind of a good example, Joe, that you could tell us about, and so just to have this a little bit transparent.
Yes, thanks, Nicole. So, and I think this goes to a comment that Tony Carr put in the chat actually about benefit conditionality, for example, because if it depends what relationship the pairs have in other areas with employers. So, for example, if employers associate the public employment service with making their workload heavier because of lots of unsolicited job applications, then that will have a bearing. So I think all pairs need to think about what else is being delivered to employers. And also and think about their messaging as well. And I suppose there's also something there about the broader welfare state context, and that sort of trust between employers and governments. But without going too far down that route, at the micro level, it's really critical that those the staff who are going out engaging with employers take the time to listen to employers, really listen to their requirements, and also not go in straight away making demands and trying to sell programs, but actually, going quite slowly. Also do homework so that, do your labour market analysis, get some information from various sources, whether that's official statistics or, the anecdotal evidence that you get from walking or travelling around a particular local labour market. And kind of understand the labour market that employer is operating on. And also, importantly, under-promising and over-delivering. So not telling the employer that you can give them all these candidates and they're all going to be, job ready on day one. And because we've got many examples where the employers have said, someone did take the time to listen to me, but then they didn't deliver what I asked. And it was extremely frustrating. And equally, we have examples, some of which are in the article written about the Australian employers, and another one I'm currently writing, where employers did have a good experience and they actually came to rely on the pairs for their recruitments. and that can happen. And you'll be the first port of call for that employer. So there's just a couple of insights, and there are many more as well, but I hope that helps, and I'm very happy for people to reach out to me.
Thank you so much for your answer on this one, and I think it was very transparent to have just an example on what really can make public employment services and also private institution getting more into collaboration with employers. So thank you so much. Unfortunately, we really have to cut this webinar at 11 o'clock, and I see that we have some couple other questions which we will be definitely answering in the sum up. So we will be sending something out to all of attendees, to all of registered persons. So additionally, if you're a member of WAPES, there will also be a folder dedicated to this webinar in our members area, which you can access. So Amandine, maybe you can show the last couple of slides. These slides will be sent to all of you. If you have remaining questions, also don't hesitate to contact myself or Anna-Karin and Joe, as they have been telling you already several times today. We'll send you also their presentations. It will include also their contact information, so you can contact them also directly if you want to. And before we will end, I would also like to remind you that at the end, whenever you're leaving, there will be a short feedback sessions where you can give us a feedback in order to see if we can improve on anything or if you liked our webinars. So please don't forget to share your feedback. It would be really very much appreciated. So as we conclude, I also want to express my gratitude to each and every one of you today for participating to make this a really global event. And my hope is really that you depart today with a feeling of being inspired, also by Anna-Karin and Joe's input of today on the ILO Convention and employment outreach. Also, I want to take this time and really to thank you also the interpreters for this wonderful job they've done to make this accessible also to our French-speaking and Spanish-speaking community. Thank you so much, and I wish you all a fantastic day, afternoon, or maybe night ahead of you, regardless of your current location on our planet, wherever this may be. Thank you so much, and I really hope to see you soon.